Surely your goodness and unfailing love will even pursue me when my days are done. When I fall to my knees now, despite what I've done, I will live in the house of the one that I love. I will live in the house of the Lord forever. Live in the house of the Lord forever. Live in the house of the Lord forever and ever. Amen. I will live in the house of the Lord forever. Live in the house of the Lord forever. Live in the house of the Lord forever and ever. Amen. The Lord is my shepherd. I have all I need. He lets me have rest in meadows of green. Even when I walk through darkness so deep, I will not be afraid. He's fighting for me. I will live in the house of the Lord forever. Live in the house of the Lord forever. Live in the house of the Lord forever and ever. Amen. I will live in the house of the Lord forever. Live in the house of the Lord forever. Live in the house of the Lord forever and ever. Amen. I know you're beside me, remembering me. You're there when I'm hiding, setting me free. I will give it all away to keep you with me, to feel your warm embrace, my crucified King. I will live in the house of the Lord forever. Live in the house of the Lord forever. Live in the house of the Lord forever and ever. Amen. I will live in the house of the Lord forever. Live in the house of the Lord forever. Live in the house of the Lord forever and ever. Amen. I know you're beside me, remembering me. You're there when I'm hiding, setting me free. I will give it all away to keep you with me, to feel your warm embrace, my crucified King.
Good evening, Lifeline community. My name is Melanie Contreras. I am part of the Lifeline leadership team. Tonight's program will be a little bit different from the others in that we will be having a conversation regarding what has been happening these past couple weeks and actually for the past several hundred years. The Adventist Church has a history of being predominantly silent when it comes to issues of race and inequality. This in no way means that we should continue the tradition of silence when so many of our brothers and sisters within and out of the church are being oppressed. Jesus exemplified advocacy in its highest form, defending the poor, uplifting women, and protecting the oppressed in the face of cultural and political backlash. Regardless of our organization's official stance, we are still charged with the responsibility to stand up for our brothers and sisters in Christ. Ellen G. White has stated, the American nation owes a debt of love to the colored race, and God has ordained that they should make restitution for the wrong they have done them in the past. Those who have taken no active part in enforcing slave labor upon the colored people are not relieved from the responsibility of making efforts to remove as far as possible the result of their enslavement. Things that we are going to be discussing now, it may be hard to hear that our church community has not been as active as we would have liked, but we pray that God will give us an open mind and an open heart so that we may be agents and advocates for change. And one of the best ways to do that is by having a discussion. So I invite you to listen, to process, to think, and to allow God to guide you and lead you as we listen to this conversation. It may be a bit longer, but we appreciate you staying with us through it all. And feel free to get in touch with us. Thank you.
Good evening. We want to welcome you to Lifeline Worship. I'm Pastor Stephen, and I'm here alongside of Joe Frashino and Mike Miller. And we're super grateful that you would join us today for this conversation. It's a really important conversation. Obviously, you know that there has been a lot of discussion, a lot of outcry, and in some ways controversy over what has kind of taken place that we've seen in Minnesota, Minneapolis, as well as across the country and even across the world when it comes to racism and this issue of systemic oppression. And we're going to explore some of that tonight. I know all of us have a different understanding, a different, maybe even a different viewpoint. But our goal this evening as brothers in Christ is to tackle this issue and to really talk about what you can do as a Christian and how you can make a difference in your community, in your family. So we're going to take a second to introduce ourselves. Mike, why don't you lead us off, man?
Mike Miller, pastor in San Antonio, Texas, and from Harlem, New York, Black American, or I'll explain how I define myself a little later. Well, I can say it now. I'm ADOS. See the shirt. American descendants of slavery, formerly known as African American. And briefly, the reason why we choose that description is because Africa is a continent, America is a country, and so that seemed to not adequately define who we are and our lineage in this country since 1619. So that's who I am in a nutshell. I'll share a little more later.
Joe, go ahead, man.
I'm Joe Frashino. I'm graduated from Southern Adventist University. I've been a missionary. I've worked with Pastor Stephen in Avon Park, and a couple years ago, my wife and I moved up to Tampa, where I'm currently the Bible teacher and chaplain for high school students at North Tampa Christian Academy. So, obviously my background is white. I'm glad to be here with Stephen and Mike. Thanks, man.
Yeah, for those of you that don't know, in Avon Park, I'm Stephen Sigamini. My family hails from India. Recently did I guess I did a 23andMe test because I wanted to make sure where I was from, and I was 99.9% South Asian. So that is my heritage. But I grew up in South Carolina, and that was definitely a different experience for a lot of South Asians, as well as just kind of getting my first glimpse into what racism looked like at a very early age. And that's kind of where we're going to take this off. I think for me, I first encountered it, growing up in the South. Things are pretty black and white in terms of where the way society's structured, like, and America in general is kind of based on a lot of its history. I guess at least post, if you were to go beyond the beyond the natives, which is a separate situation in American history. But if you basically are kind of modern, it's really white and black. And for me, kind of growing up, not in one of those brackets, I kind of fit into the other side of it. And, you know, I kind of noticed really in kindergarten that I was different than everybody else, but it was easier for me to kind of pull towards the darker side because I was darker versus white. So kind of, what is your guys' experience with racism? When's the first time you encountered it, and how do you understand racism? Like, what is racism? Whoever wants to go first.
I'll go. So I grew up in Virginia. My dad was in the military. We grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood. Went to a predominantly white high school. So I don't think I ever really experienced racism per se, like growing up. I mean, my family didn't, we were raised as Christians to, treat everyone the same. But I don't know that there were really any like major issues growing up. I think the first time I experienced racism was probably when I was at Southern. There's stories of friends and, at Southern, I had my first really close Black friend. We lived together, worked together on a lot of projects. And I remember him having an experience where he was at the store and one of the white ladies at the store, made a comment towards him about his color. I also had a Hispanic friend who came with me up north, that I knew in college, and passing someone in the grocery store, threw a racist comment towards him. So it wasn't really until I got out of, Virginia, where I grew up, and came to Southern, and made more friends that were not white, that I really started kind of seeing the way that they were treated and comments and things that were thrown at them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So me growing up, like I said, so just the brief history. So my maternal grandmother and grandfather, they're from my maternal grandmother, she's from Eufaula, Alabama, small town in Alabama, and my paternal grandmother and my paternal grandfather's from Greenville, Alabama. My maternal grandmother is from Doran, Georgia. So I've always been raised with I said this in the sermon before, my mom always told me and my older brother, and she would say specifically to me, Michael, you're a Black man in America. So it just in those moments, she had already identified me and who I was. So this is kind of this first introduction into race, right? Because she now is establishing who I am in view of a larger society. But then then growing and starting to read the autobiography of Malcolm X was a very pivotal book in my life. I was about 19, and reading about because it typically in the U.S. the way education is, we don't typically get a lot of stories about racism. We just hear that there was slavery, and then Martin Luther King had a dream, and then that was it. So we pretty much don't typically dive deeper into the racial history of America. And so it's through this extra learning, and Malcolm X famously got pretty much attained his education while in prison. It's just this self-education, learning the ways in which racism exists, because I think a lot of the distinctions, racism is typically seen a lot and viewed a lot as the same as discrimination, whereas discrimination is a part of racism, but racism is more a system in place that subjugates a particular group, as opposed to discrimination. Discrimination would be maybe one of the tenets of racism. And so it was through studying and understanding racism, because a lot of times you hear, oh, Black people can be racist too, but if given what I believe the true definition of racism in terms of a systematic oppression and subjugation of a particular group, then then there's no way to particularly say that an ADOS community could be racist in that way. And so this was from reading and studying and then just experiencing life, kind of seeing how racism exists and is implemented in this society, in the US particularly.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Mike, because like growing up in the South, like I think I encountered a lot of comments, right? Like,
Sure.
oh, that was a racist comment, right? Or a prejudice comment. But I think it wasn't till later in life that I really like kind of saw the whole systematic side of it, right? The systemic side of racism, systemic side of oppression. Because I think at a very early age, like, when I was in first grade, I remember a kid made a comment in regards to me smelling like curry, right? Like, and that was the first time I ever like heard or understood something to be racist, right? But then for me, I was like, yo, so this, I was like, okay, that's racist. So very early on, I could say, oh, in church, that person, they made a racist comment, right? I'd be in church and they would dislike the way a Black person engaged in worship. And I'm like, man, they're racist. But I think I missed the sort of systemic side of it. And I don't know, Joe, if you kind of had that experience too, where it was like, and as Mike said, like sort of the way we were taught history was like, it began like, okay, this happened 1865, Abraham Lincoln, Emancipation Proclamation, boom. Martin Luther King shows up, but there's no cognitive dissonance as to why do we need Martin Luther King then, right? Like what's the whole thing? And then now 50, or at that time 35 years later, when I was in elementary school, it's like racism is done. Racism all of a sudden is dead. And so it was just this weird sort of idea. Joe, I wonder what was your experience kind of with this realization of what systemic racism is, and maybe even what your understanding of it is now?
Yeah, so you're hitting a lot of good things, Stephen. White people don't normally talk about this stuff, right? I mean, we learn about it in school, and you learn about like the different periods of oppression, right? So I mean, I remember in school being taught, early on, we have the period where Blacks are slaves, right? And then we go this next period where we've got Jim Crow, where we've got segregation, and then come, civil rights movement, right? That's kind of taught as, this is now equality, racism is done with in America, and everything is fine. So I think that goes into part of why people really don't talk about, and I know a lot of people don't like this phrase, but we don't talk about white privilege, or we don't acknowledge, certain struggles that other people in America who are not white go through. And I think as I've learned, especially over the last year or so, and it really started when I met you, Stephen, the more you learn, you start to realize that in America, you don't have to necessarily actively be racist. There's a system already in place that is carrying out those, I don't know what the word is, those ideals, right? Because they were created in a time where that was intentional, right? So post-slavery, pre-civil rights, that whole 100-year period, Blacks in America and, other minority groups were intentionally put down, were intentionally had laws and things created against them, even though they may not have been super obvious. They were obvious at the time, and everybody knew what was happening. And I think that's where you start to see this system, the system really oppress people of color. And so here we are living in 2020 on a system that was created back in the early 1900s and has been carried out all this time. And so this is why I think we're having so many issues, because post-civil rights, racism didn't really die, right? And I think this systemic oppression that we're talking about is something that was created a long time ago that we're still living in today. And I really think it's coming to light at this point, because we have new generations of young people. I mean, our generation loves to travel and be well cultured and accepting of other people, but our generation is not going to deal with a system that was created to intentionally oppress colored people in America. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think, I mean, to answer your question, I guess more to the point, I think, recently when I started learning and educating myself is when I started to realize white privilege is a real thing. And systemic oppression is a real thing. And we don't, and I don't think we talk about it very much for two reasons, either because it makes it really awkward to talk about, or just because we weren't raised that way. We're not intentionally doing it. And so we think that there's nothing wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's huge you say that. Mike, one of the things that I feel like people always talk about when they see things, like now we live in a world that's media based, right? So there's more things captured on camera, right? So George Floyd's death was on camera, so it's hard to argue with what you see. Ahmaud Arbery, right? A video kind of came out. So there's less discrepancy. But one of the things that I always hear people say is, the system is broken, right? The system is failing. But what Joe was just saying, like, doesn't make it sound like the system is broken. It makes it sound like the system is functioning the way it was created to function, right? Mike, I don't know if you want to unpack that a little bit, just, and how you kind of understand that whole idea.
Phenomenal. Both of you, phenomenal points, because it is a system that was, so America pretty much decided winners and losers, right? So in order for someone to win, someone has to lose. So a lot of times you hear the analogy that the ADOS community was the boots. So you always hear this term, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And it's typically a term associated with like Horatio Alger and this idea that people just sprout up out of poverty in this American culture. But really the history is far from the truth. But early on America, so when you think about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, well, a lot of people see the ADOS community was specifically the boots that were used for the white community to rise to power, because you think 1619, the first slave comes here in Virginia, and from 246 years of chattel slavery. Now, there was slavery in many countries, but America had a unique slavery that was unlike any other country. Like, yes, the transatlantic slave trade had different slaves throughout what's known as the African diaspora and in different nations, but the American chattel slavery was unique. And number one, you were your children and children's children, so generations were automatically slaves. And it lasted longer than any other slavery throughout the Western world in terms of when slavery ends in 1865, and then the brutality that goes into the slavery of raping and all the different things, splitting apart families. So all of these things were meant to fuel the American economy. I think it's by 1861, right before the Civil War gets to its peak, cotton was the #1 import-export in America. So literally this American economy, the America that everyone enjoys, you can draw a straight line to when the first African comes in 1619. And so now that's a system that designs, there's this great documentary on PBS called Slavery by Another Name. And so every generation, and I think you both gentlemen mentioned it, every generation there was a new reiteration of slavery. So 1619, first slave comes here. Civil War happens, 1865, Emancipation Proclamation. But slavery doesn't end there, because you have what's now the convict leasing system. So from 1865 to maybe 1941, when the peonage law is struck down, where you have where there are vagrancy laws. And vagrancy laws they're just different types of laws created to deem individuals a criminal, because with the 13th Amendment, there's a caveat in it, and I'm sure we've all watched the documentary 13th, which says slavery is abolished except for if you become a criminal and go to prison. So now with these vagrancy laws, like for example, loitering, these just formerly enslaved people have now been left off their plantation. They have nowhere to live. Slave patrol sees you, you're loitering, you get arrested. Now you can be thrown back into slavery, back on the very plantation that you were just freed from. That happens in 1941. The peonage law struck. Then you have 1965 Civil Rights Act. But that whole time, you're having Jim Crow, as you guys mentioned, where it's separate but equal, but it's not equal at all. And you have these separate states. And then now, what we're dealing with since the mid 70s to now is you have this tough on crime and you have mass incarceration. Whereas now, again, for example, 2 years ago, we had prisoners the incarcerated in California fighting the wildfires for less than $1 a day, right? And so you have that happening because now you have legalized slavery. So, and then in the midst of this time with mass incarceration, you incentivize municipalities and local areas to fund the prisons, because now there's private prisons, so people can literally make money off of prison. And so once you start getting this private industry, now you have to fill those jail cells, i.e. fill the opportunities to create and continue the wealth machine and the economic superpower that we see today. So at every step in America's history, they've decided the system will be that there is going to be money there is a need for an economic boost. And the way to do that and to keep the machine going is to keep this one group systematically at the bottom. And so that's why the system in and of itself, the racist white supremacist system that exists in America exists because of all these different reasons. Is that, again, there's a need for winners and losers. And so the losers have already been selected. And so in different generations, we keep repackaging and rebranding how we create the loser.
So that was a lot to unpack.
My fault, man.
No, a lot to like reflect on too, because I feel like I took away something. And those of you tuning in, like, I know that's something that is, I know there's this sort of idea, right? So for me, I went through this kind of cognitive dissonance, right? Like, where I think in school, right, people that I looked up to, whether it was teachers, whether it was even mentors, and how I understood America was very different to me. And I think I went through this, right, a little bit of what you're saying, you know, in my own way. Like, I remember when we did a project and, you know, we'd have international fair at school, right? And you know, we did the United States, and that was the country, right? And so I remember, like, when all of us, you know, all the minorities in the class, there was about 4 or 5 black kids in the class. There was me, I think there was one Hispanic kid, and they were talking about how we were gonna dress up as these, you know, forefather people. And all of us looked at each other like, yo, we don't look like any of these people, you know? And so they're like, you know, I remember I think I was Abraham Lincoln. And I remember, like, you know, they, you know, we had the top hat and the beard and all of that. But I was like, I'm not wearing this beard. I said, first of all, I don't look like Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln was like, I don't know how, I remember at a young age, Abraham Lincoln had slaves. He just made that law because everybody else was pushing him in. Or like, you know, so it was just this weird sort of grappling. But that kind of leads me to something else that I want to, like, that's what you're saying, right? Because I know now if you've watched 13th, which is a great documentary on Netflix, a super easy way to kind of get educated on what we're talking about and kind of see how that relates to where we are today. Mm-hmm. And what about this idea is, because people say, like, okay, you know, my ancestors may have done this, right? The forefathers may have done this. Abraham Lincoln may have been racist, or, you know, the forefathers may have been racist. But how is that my fault in 2020? Like, that whole idea, right? Like, is it really my fault? Like, I'm not racist. I have friends that are black. I have family members. I've dated someone from another race or whatever, right? So to me, like, and we've had a black president. So how could it still be my fault? Why do I need to grapple with this? Or even, like, sure, I'll know the history, but why do I really have to? Why does it matter still? You know, what do you guys think about that question? Like, in 2020, why does it matter? You know, and is it my fault?
It's definitely something that I've heard. I mean, I've heard the phrase, you know, in relation to slavery. You know, I wasn't around when that happened, so this whole issue is not my fault or doesn't pertain to me. But I think this is I think the response is an extended issue of systemic oppression, what we were just talking about. And when you understand the historical part of it, then you can really understand why what's happening is happening right now. And I think a byproduct of the systemic oppression that we just talked about in history and how it was implemented and the criminalizing of Blacks and the destroyed reputation that society gave them, through movies or through, media, whatever it may be. I think for me, the statement that, sure, I wasn't around, right? I can acknowledge that I was not around during those times, but I don't think that exempts me from the obligation of taking some sort of responsibility, right? As far as making things right, not in a sense of guilt, but in a sense of that's my duty as a Christian and that's my duty as an American, right? Mm-hmm. If we truly believe that America was founded on Christian morals, and we truly believe that as Christians God created each one equal, right? Mm-hmm. Then although I wasn't there when that took place, it is my job to do what I can do to reverse the destroyed reputation of Blacks in America. That's and some of that may not necessarily be tangible because it's been happening, for hundreds of years. But I think that really starts with an inward reflection. Why do I feel the way I feel? Why do other people feel the way they feel when they encounter a Black person? Why do I have certain privileges that other people in America don't have, right? Day to day, what are some things that they experience, the struggles that they experience that I don't experience? That all flows from the historical side that we talked about. The movie 13th was huge for me. It was a huge educational moment for me to understand why certain things are the way that they are. Mm-hmm. And I think when you start to understand those things, sure, you can say, I wasn't around during slave time, so that's not my fault. Well, you can't dismiss the issue either. And I think that there's a responsibility that comes along. If you're going to say that and acknowledge that, there's still an issue that follows that you are responsible for, and that's moving forward and fixing the system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mike, what do you think when in regards to this whole idea of a fault, right? And maybe you probably may not yourself have thought that, right? But how do you how would you explain that to somebody or communicate to somebody if they ask you that question?
The exact way Joe just did. That was beautiful because what Joe is talking about is so phenomenal in just the premise of the question. That is the idea that you would ask a question like that. For example, let's say you see someone there's some let's say you're a guy and you see a woman being beat up in the street and you just say, well, it's not me, so I didn't do it. So if she's laying there, I'm not calling the police. No, I don't have, it's not my fault that she was beat up by him. It's that same kind of thinking. It's not a one-to-one, but it's the same kind of thinking of if you see a community being abused and being taken advantage of, just because you weren't directly responsible for it, even though the point is you benefit from it, doesn't mean you should do nothing. And it's to Joe's point is that's a question now you have to add. That's time to do introspection, to ask yourself, well, why do I feel? It's sort of this, psychology talks about this bystander effect, where we all will see something happening and no one will do anything because you see nobody else doing anything.
Yeah.
So you get to take this stance of, it's not me, but in other situations where you see oppression, you wouldn't do that. And Joe hit on the point of, especially for the Christians, we don't have any option to make that moral argument. But when you think about the ways in which, because a lot of times I hear, we selectively choose when we want to be moral or amoral. So in certain cases where it comes to the issue of systemic oppression, one of the reasons why the question to ask of, well, it's not my fault, is implicitly behind that is, I don't want to do anything. I don't want to do anything. Because when this is heavy information, and so to receive all this information in sort of like a rapid time, and now in our society, we don't give people a chance to evolve in their learning. And that's even something, particularly in the ADOS community, in the Black community at large, I think there's a level of, we can allow for people to grow in their knowledge while still fighting these fights now, because we're in dire straits, and we've been in dire straits since we've been here. But for people, white and some Black people may think that of themselves, like, this has nothing to do with me. I have an opportunity, because we have that within our own communities of people that are saying, it's not for us to change it anymore. We've gotten equal rights, so let's just go from there. But for anyone asking that question of, it's not my fault, so why do I have to deal with it? Then I think that's a more deeper internal question of, if you see someone suffering, why would you not want to help? And what does that say about you as an individual? Because we all have to, even if you don't believe in God, we all have to ask ourselves, to the analogy I gave, if you saw someone being physically abused in front of you, and they're lying on the floor dying, would you call the police, or would you just say, well, I didn't do it? Your natural response would more than likely be to go and get help, to help that person. That's the case with the ADOS community and the Black community as a whole. That our community has been abused for now 401 years. 401, it'll be 401 years in August. Our community has been abused, and not only are you witnessing the abuse, but you benefit from the abuse. So now it gives an even more of a responsibility, knowing that you are directly a beneficiary of the abuse. So it's a deeper question you would have to be asking yourself, and wanting to do better for your community.
Yeah, it's so huge that you mentioned that, because I think even if we go in a Christian context, right? One of the most common parables, right? Good Samaritan, right? This whole idea of, oh, well, it wasn't my fault. I had nothing to do with it. And it's a decision, right? Am I gonna do something about it, or am I just gonna pass it by? Right. Or even Jesus, when he's talking to in Matthew 25, when he's separating the sheep from the goats, right? This whole idea of, did you help me when you X, Y, and Z? And Jesus is saying he's in the midst of that. And that could be, and so it's so interesting that you say that too. One of the other things that I think, at least in my community, right, kind of being not on the side of white or Black, right, for us, we have kind of, other minority groups kind of say, well, it's their fight, like, okay, it's an American fight. I'm just kind of going to stay in my circle and not worry about it too much, and not make it a big deal. Like for me, when I was growing up, I was kind of just told subconsciously, or maybe even directly, like, hey, just do your best, study hard, and eventually you have all the opportunities in the world. And some of that is true. I do carry a little bit more opportunity, just because oftentimes in my ethnic group, we tend to live a little bit higher, technically, based on whether that's, what livelihood, right? And so even this whole idea of the model minority, right, as an Asian, or even other minorities, right, this sort of idea, oh, you can come here as an immigrant and be successful, right? The land of opportunity. Sure. But I think for many people that I've even seen in my family and family friends, they kind of look and they see African Americans or ADOS, the community, and they're like, well, see, if they would just work harder, and or if they would just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right, that they would be able to be successful. But I think it's so much deeper, and I think education is necessary, and really, the heart of Christ, I believe, is super necessary in kind of understanding this idea of empathy and history, and how what happened in the past does affect the present, even though it may not affect our present. I think it's so key. Does anybody want to add anything else on this part?
Yeah. I wanted to touch on that, hopefully we're pastors, so we just have a tendency
I
to
mean, we
ramble.
gotta go, you know.
But just to your point about other ethnic groups and other immigrant communities, see and you hit on how it's deeper. See, because what white supremacy and what racism was able to do, which was unique in America, was make everyone a color, right? So people
Yeah.
are typically, and we know this biblically, you don't see people being described by their complexions. You see them being described by their locations and their people groups. So you hear 12 tribes of Judah, you don't know what complexion they are. We pretty much, the region they're from, we kind of know their complexion. But the fact that we even think in these terms is because of what white supremacy was able to do, because the point is that everyone that had the same complexion wasn't all. How we view whiteness, particularly in America in this system, is it's a wealth status. It's not complexion, because as you just said, Stephen, your family, you've typically, been able to live sort of maybe a higher socioeconomic status than most ADOS. Well, me and you, if we walked in the street, they could think we're brothers. So we have the same complexion. So it's not necessarily that. And then even, for example, there were, Joe, I don't know if your family originally is from Italy, or I don't want to.
Yeah, I have some European background, a little bit of German,
Okay.
a little bit of Polish and Italian. Yeah, but
Okay.
I mean, up until my great grandparents, we lived in America.
Okay, right. So there was a time where Italians were not considered quote unquote white, and so they were a minority group. And there's a great book about how the Irish became white, right? So because remember, Irish fled the potato famine, came here, and they were indentured servants at times. They weren't slaves like ADOS, but they were indentured servants. Same thing with the Chinese. They had a Chinese Exclusion Act. So you think about that 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act. Before then, there were quotas. So America literally had certain groups that they deemed quote unquote white in terms of access to wealth. So when we look at this situation in America, and this is why I'm saying ADOS is particularly the group that was decided to be the losers, is because other groups were able to immigrate into this country and not necessarily deal with the ramifications or the continuous racial subjugation by quote unquote color, because as we've seen, it's not really a color. It's just who America deems acceptable into the white structure of wealth, right? More so than a brown person comes into America. Yeah, they may not be able to get a cab, but that's again that whole concept is us viewing ourselves through the lens of a racist, right? Because for example, we would never see, so for example, Stephen, perfect example, if someone said, when we typically hear of the model minority, a lot of the time and historically, that was specifically speaking to Chinese and Japanese immigrants. It wasn't necessarily speaking about Indian immigrants, right? And so by labeling everyone one thing, then it diminishes. A really good example, if I was to see someone from China and say, oh, where are you from? Korea? That's offensive, right? Because you're just assuming. But for some strange reason, the way America has decided that we just base everyone on Crayola, that everyone brown is the same. So, and it diminishes, and it's disrespectful. But my community, we still like have this challenge with seeing ourselves as just African, when Africa is a continent, 54 countries. All of the countries aren't the same. They all have their different issues. Egyptians don't look like Ethiopians, et cetera, et cetera. But this is this white supremacist idea that we could just label people by color, when really America is based on wealth and economics, not just a color scheme. The color scheme attributes and contributes to the discrimination and things like that, but it's really just based on a particular group as opposed to. So I just wanted to touch on that because
yeah, that was really good, because I think too what you're saying about kind of the dividing too of races, right? I even think about when I would take a test, and literally I still go through this now, and I just celebrated when I took the 2020 census, and they actually had a category that said like Indian, because I remember like I would tell people, oh, I'm Asian, like I'm technically Asian. They'd be like, no, you're not. I'm like, what do you know? I'm like, clearly, you know, but it's very clearly like it's in Asia, but it's this sort of idea, right? You know, because I think it's an idea of what they see, right? A complexion, identity. So that's huge. And then how that's tied to socioeconomics. Man, like I've had a great time so far. Just kind of exploring this. I hope that you all have been able to grow and learn something from this conversation. I'm gonna shift gears a little bit. You know, one of the things that has been controversial, right, has been this idea, right? You know, people have been saying Black Lives Matter, and kind of the response that is given is, you know, all lives matter, and this idea that every other minority has struggled, right? Someone may say, well, look at Stephen, right? Stephen has gone through a lot of racial inequality in his life, right? So doesn't his life matter? Or Joe, you know, though it doesn't mean there's and to your point too, Mike, you were saying if it's a socioeconomic thing, well, there's poor white people. You know, I don't think Joe is living in, you know, a palace. So how do we, you know, my palace is in heaven, bro. Like all of us, you know, this whole idea of like, what is problematic with, you know, all lives matter. I mean, because technically as Christians, right, that is a true statement, right? You know, in the eyes of Christ, I would say everyone is equal, right? Everybody is valued. But I'm gonna direct this to you first, Mike. Like, what is this sort of, you know, what's the big deal about saying all lives matter, or singling out and saying, you know, white lives matter, or whatever?
Well, I mean, just given everything we talked about, just on the surface, when someone says that, it's dismissive, right? Because if I'm protesting breast cancer and you come up and say, well, all cancer matters, why are you dismissing the fact that I'm talking about breast cancer? If my house is burning and I say, let's get some water for my house to put it off to, I saw a meme about it. It was like, when my house is burning and somebody else's house is not burning, and you come up and say, well, all houses matter. But what does that have to do with the house that's on fire? Are we going to get water or talk about every other house? So just on the surface, it's dismissive. But why is it important? Because of everything we just spoke of. When you have basically, our community has not mattered, because that's why you see all the oppression, you see all the denigration, and to the point of poor whites versus poor blacks. You know, based on the numbers, economically, when you look at it, poor white is like middle class black, right? So the median black household is $1,700 in wealth. The median white household is $170,000 in wealth. So when you look at a middle class black is a poor white, because again, when you have a 246 years of slavery, then 100 years of Jim and Jane Crow systematically being locked out, for example, like with the New Deal and all of the policies that were given in the New Deal, which literally took destroys the Horatio Alger myth of white people just pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. No, government intervention pulled the formerly poor whites to a middle class to now the upper class today. So when we say Black Lives Matter, because we see that we are disproportionately in the criminal justice system, there are more Black men in America incarcerated, almost 700,000, than women incarcerated globally. There's 4 billion women, and there's less globally. So let that sink in. So when we start talking about Black Lives Matter, what we're talking about is that this one group, for some odd reason, keeps being at the bottom of the totem pole and keeps intentionally being at the bottom of the totem pole. So when you deflect to, well, everybody's life matters. But if I say a bottom group is at the totem pole, then you would, in order to make all lives matter fit, you would have to say, well, everyone's at the bottom of the totem pole, but everybody isn't at the bottom of the totem pole. So that's the point. And that's what Black Lives Matter says. It says that this specific group does not matter to the American government. In fact, they only matter to the American government as a way in which to fuel the economy off of their backs and pain and suffering. So just in general, all lives matter is a dodge, and it's an excuse. And it's similar to, well, it's not my fault that slavery happened. It's one of those things where you don't want to be responsible, and you really would really prefer that everybody be quiet about it, so you can get back to your what Joe mentioned, your white privilege, where you get to enjoy life and you get to have benign neglect and you get to ignore everything, which is unfortunately a situation where, as much as we can try as the ADOS community, Black community at large, we don't have that option.
Joe, what do you think, man?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Mike. I think so. The way that I've thought about it is that the statement "all lives matter" is this umbrella, right? That, of course, we all believe that. Christians believe that. People believe. I mean, you don't have to be Christian to believe that life is life and life is important. That all lives matter. It does. It's not rocket science. And I think underneath that umbrella, there are different struggles, right? But we can't neglect the fact that there's definitely a struggle between Blacks and whites in our country. So the issue that is at hand right now is that issue. And I think to deflect Black Lives Matter at a moment where that's the issue that we're struggling with, and to say, to generalize back up to that umbrella that says all lives matter, I think one, just like Mike said, I think it's dismissive and it's disrespectful. And I also think that what you're doing by either generalizing that statement or fighting against the Black Lives Matter group, I think what you're doing is actually destroying the opportunity to reverse what has been done over the last 100 or 200 years. So we briefly touched before on this systemic process that has continually mistreated and oppressed Blacks in America and other people. I mean, we also briefly touched on, other minority groups. I think the Black first white thing in America has taken spotlight, but I don't think that other minority groups are not a part of that. But by specifically saying all lives matter, you're stopping the progress of reversing the ideology of that system that was created, that we talked about before. Because although it's not my fault, I still have a responsibility in reversing that. And by generalizing it, I'm stopping that responsibility.
Yeah, man. Yeah, that's so key, because I think too the idea with all lives matter and some of these other things, because I know that I've recently heard a lot of people in regards to police brutality, right, with George Floyd, or the citizens arrest. I say that with Ahmaud Arbery, right? And well, I have bad experiences with cops too, or I know somebody that got shot by the cop and they weren't Black. And I think this whole idea, right, well, let's highlight everybody, or even maybe, and we've talked about a little bit, sort of selective outrage of what's kind of pushed towards African Americans. Well, why aren't you upset about the police chief that was killed? Or why aren't you talking about Black and Black crime, right? This whole idea. I think a lot of it for me is, well, one, when we look at Black on Black crime, right, it's one of those things, well, how do you know what that community is discussing? How do you know what's going on? The only reason I heard a lot about what was going on in the African American community when I would get my haircut, when I would go to the barber. These guys were talking about, hey man, there was a shooting down on Fifth Street. There was a man, this dude got arrested, got locked up, and it was very different than the conversations that I heard, in other communities when it came to that. And so much of that, I think, is tied to the history, right? So, like, for example, George Floyd dies right at the hands of cops, but for so many people, it's, he died, that was bad, that was wrong. I don't know if you guys have met anyone that said that was a justified death. I don't know if you guys have you heard.
I've had. It's interesting because I preached about it last week. I preached on Matthew 25:40, and whatsoever we do to the least of these. You mentioned it. That's kind of like the verse that like springboard my ministry, and that's what carries me. And I particularly wore a T-shirt that said Jesus also couldn't breathe, because that's how you die through crucifixion. You don't die you die because you suffocate. And so Jesus couldn't breathe. And so I related that because as Jesus, from verse 35 and 35 and 36, he said, I was hungry. What Jesus keeps labeling is he's labeling marginalized groups. He's saying hungry, poor people. He's saying, and he even says, I was a prisoner and you came to visit me. So Jesus is highlighting all these marginalized groups. So I preached it, and I got a call on Monday that some of my members were offended that I would dare to compare Jesus to George Floyd. And the key, what they said was, he was a felon. He got arrested 5 times. And so it's to the point where that is justifying his murder. So you're saying it was supposed to happen because he did all of the, and you typically see this a lot with media. Media will give the rap sheet. They did it with Michael Brown when he was murdered by Darren Wilson in Ferguson.
Yeah.
Immediately, he was stealing cigarillos from the store. So we had to create the narrative to justify his murder. So this was the same scenario where there's now, he can't be compared to Jesus, even though Jesus compares himself, because we don't know that George Floyd actually committed a crime in that moment. We never know, because the way our country works is you have to have a trial. You have to have a lawyer. There has to be a trial to determine innocent and guilt. He never got that. The officer served as judge, jury, and executioner. So but even putting that aside, even if he was guilty, he didn't deserve to be murdered in that way. But again, Jesus said that I am the prisoner. And in fact, Hebrews 13:3 points to the fact that it's believed the Apostle Paul says, view yourselves with the prisoner as if chained with them. So that means Jesus is identifying himself with the prisoner. So, but it was to this point where there is a rush to justify. I've actually experienced a rush to justify and say, well, he was doing bad things. He deserved to die because he shouldn't be compared to Jesus. So
Yeah. I mean, it's true, because like when it happened initially, there was this kind of debate, right? What happened when the camera wasn't on, or he was high on fentanyl, or he was, all these different things. And man, what you're saying about the gospel is so crazy, right? Just this whole idea about Jesus not being able to breathe, and Jesus taking on whatever it was. So irregardless of George Floyd is a criminal, but this idea that all of us have sinned, right? All of us have, and Jesus kind of taking that on, man, is so beautiful. But I think in the context of where we've been at, right, with George Floyd and with these different people that have died, like looking at in the context of a fallen world, and here we're kind of transitioning towards the end. There's so much more I want to talk about, but like in the life of George Floyd, right, in him passing away, for many people, and depending on your community, with the exception of the ADOS community, African American community, right, for many of us, we can just take that isolated incident and say, yo, that was wrong. The cop was wrong. And kind of move on with our lives. The cops get arrested, and we go on with our lives. Whereas for a specific community, it's tied to something so much deeper. It's tied to generations of history. It's tied to my grandfather possibly being in that situation, right? And or their cousin or themselves. And I think it's so much deeper. And I think as Christians, right, we have to be willing to kind of set aside our privilege or our preference or our comfortability, right? In those situations, like, because I think for everybody, they watch a video of somebody losing their life and it does something. There's a visceral response. I had a visceral response. My visceral response was I threw a water bottle across the room. That was my visceral response to watching somebody's life, fade away unjustly. And I think as a Christian, like, we have to be willing to see that and be in line with that empathy, right? It's not so much that I'm asking you to protest, or I'm asking you to make us. I'm asking you to empathize, and I think that's what Christ was saying. Like because so many times I think it shifts only when we know the person, right?
Yeah.
And that brings us back to that text in Matthew 25 that you were just talking about, man. Like when the person says, man, if only I knew, then I would have helped. Yeah. Then I would have said something. See, if it had been Mike in that situation, man, I would have done something. Versus like, oh, it's George Floyd, so it's whatever. He was a criminal.
Right.
And there's so much within that, and I think it's so much easier to kind of to walk away from that and to not really grapple with it. But I think as Christians, like, we have to dig deep into that, because we fundamentally to our Christianity, is a God who dug deep into the oppression of sin, into the issues that we faced. So, man, as we kind of wrap up, I want us to kind of discuss a little bit about this idea, like, what do we do with all of this, right? Like, we've talked about so much, right? We've talked about systemic racism, what that looks like, the outrage and different things. But how do we actually like respond? What do we do as Christians with this? I don't know who wants to go first.
Sure, I'll go. So, man, it's like I need to go back real quick and touch on the whole George Floyd thing, because I think up until this point, and I'll tie it in, but I think up until this point, as Mike was saying, people hide behind the excuses as to, he was a criminal, or we don't know what happened. Stephen said, we don't know what happened when the cameras were off, and all this other stuff. And I think for a long time, people have been really ignorant to this issue. White people more specifically are ignorant to the issue, and they hide behind those things. But I think the difference with George Floyd was, and I felt it in the white community, is that there was no excuse, right? I mean, at this point, it was on camera. All the other things that were brought up to excuse what happened were false. The fake money was not fake. The condition that they put on the paper saying that he already had some sort of sickness or something, a heart condition or whatever, before the ambulance showed up. I mean, they already proved that in the 9 minutes that he could have been sitting in the back of a car, that wouldn't have made a difference, right? So you've got all these things that now the white community has nothing to hide behind.
Right.
And I think that really shocks the white community, and it forces people to reflect on that and to acknowledge that there is an issue. Now, as Christians, thinking about the issue and as Christians, what does it mean for me? I think it's a couple things, and as cliche as it sounds, I feel like what it really boils down to is love. Love on different layers, not just like human love, but loving like Christ. Mike talked about how Jesus identified himself as all the negative things. We've talked about the Good Samaritan, right? What kind of neighbor are you? That's a question. Are you the guy who walks by those who are hurting just because you're able to? In that parable, I know that the word compassion is actually broken down to, Stephen, as you were saying, like a physical body movement to feel it so much that you also want change. So this compassionate love, this deep compassionate love that Christ talks about when he says, a new commandment I'm giving to you, go love one another, not just to love them, but because the whole world will know that you are my disciples if you really love one another. That's powerful to me. Paul in Romans 12 talks about not pretending to love others, but to genuinely love them, right? So as Christians, it goes deeper than the human love that we can extend, because in our sin, there's going to be limitations. There's going to be walls. There's going to be lenses that we look through, whether we were taught them or whether they're just there. And that's another thing that I've had to reflect and process on. I wasn't raised there are certain things I was not raised knowing, but somehow they're there. And I think to really love as Christ loved is to be transformed in the way that you think, right? Don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. I think that really goes into play here as Christians. We have to love as Christ did and be completely transformed, mind and heart, in order to really attempt any sort of solution.
That was beautiful, man. And just kind of what we've been talking about. One of the Christian responses that I hear from my Christian community that kind of pains me, and Mike, I want you to touch on this after, is this idea of like, well, I'm not racist, right? Like, I know I'm not. I'm Christian and I'm not racist. But part of me, like when I look at the gospel, when I look at the way Christ responded, and I look at what Joe was talking about, right? The radical type of love, like I just feel like just not being something isn't enough, right? It can't be enough to really like work against this, right? Like, Mike, what do you like? How would you?
Man, I mean, I don't know why you want to comment from me after what Joe said. I mean, man, we could have ended right there.
All right,
Man,
we done.
that was powerful, Joe. I'm just sitting here listening. I'm all ears. I'm like, man, keep talking, man. That was beautiful. If people want to know what allyship is, that's an ally there. Like, because that's often a conversation. What does an ally look like? You heard what Joe just said, because he's touching on the most profound thing, and the most powerful thing we can have is the love of God. He gives it to us, we give it out. But directly to your point of your question is why oh, I'm not just racist. It's actually, Dr. King talked about it, and he said that the person that we should be concerned with is not the overt racist with a hood on. It's the liberal white that sits by complicitly allowing it to happen. So what he's addressing is this question of, well, I'm not racist, but when people are saying that, they're meaning it in the terms of, do you use the N-word, or do you actively hate Black people or the ADOS community? But that's not actually what has continued to funnel and foster this racist system. It's actually those who are complicit, those who say, I'm not a racist, but as you said, Stephen, do nothing else past that. They've accepted that it's okay, because what that means is you've accepted that the system that you see now is okay. You're okay with it. You're okay with the benefits that you receive, as well as the ramifications that others are inflicted on. You're okay with these things. And as we've just spoken, Christ calls us to more than that, because what he's saying in Matthew 25 is, it's not just that it happened to your neighbor. That's me. It's happening to me. Everything that you do to any marginalized group, you are doing it to me. And it makes it, and that is the love that Joe is talking about. Christ is talking about making a deeper commitment to love. Not because when you make the statement of, well, I'm not a racist, that's a deep commitment to yourself. But Christ is telling us to make a deep commitment to the love of others. Because if we start seeing it as a love to other people, and then start viewing them, as Hebrews says, chained to the prisoner, it's like Christ. When you start viewing it as it's you, it's not somebody else, then that love begins to overflow, and you begin to really, as Joe mentioned, your mind, your heart changes. And once your mind and heart changes, when we all gave our lives to Christ, we started moving and acting differently. When we started doing things differently than we used to do. And that is what happens when you get this kind of love for your fellow man. And you, as Joe is showing, you start to move and think differently, and your life begins to change, and your actions change as a result of that.
And this has been such a beautiful conversation, and I want to keep going, but I want to like stop for a second, and as we wrap this up and talk about, like, we just talked about love, we've talked about, Christianity and what it means. And I know for you may be experiencing like, hey, like maybe I'm feeling something, or maybe I'm sensing like I need to respond, or I don't know where to start. And first, like we would all say, like Mike was saying, we're all pastors, so of course we're going to point you to Christ. And I know we live in a world right now that is really, really big on, maybe you feel the pressure to share something on social media, right? Maybe you feel the pressure to go out and protest, but you feel like, man, I can't really be an ally, because that's not really my personality, right? Maybe, because I can't see myself protesting or sharing this on social media. There's potential, maybe my family members are going to misunderstand me, or my friends are going to misunderstand me. But I want to encourage you first, to at least my tip is going to be on education. We mentioned, watching documentary 13th, but more so than that, I want to invite you to kind of do what we just did right here. Sit down and talk, and get to know the story of someone. Maybe your starting point is different. Maybe you just want to hear from somebody what their experience has been like. Somebody different, somebody that looks different than you, and say, hey, what has it been like for you? What do you experience? What is your understanding even of the gospel? How have you been treated? What's your story? Because I think as Christians and as people that are pursuing that ultimate kingdom to come, we are to be in tune with that. We are to connect and to sit down across from people that are different than us, and know that in the midst of that conversation, like, I mean, all three of us, I realized we all come from different areas, but I realized we're all one and the same. And I think that's what people, I think, oftentimes like incorrectly get to, right? We all believe the same, or God is colorblind. But I think it's not that. I think it's something else that binds us, right? Something else deep that's connected. And it's a God that did create colors, a God that did create, the differences that we have, but fundamentally loved us all the same. So if you guys have any last words. And Joe, I know that, and on the note of allyship, I'm almost forgetting. Joe, you asked a question yesterday that I think when we had our conversation when we first met up, and I wanted to make sure that you highlighted that for those that are watching that aren't sure what allyship looks like. Joe, do you mind just kind of touching on that?
Yeah. First, I want to say that I think one of the greatest things that's helped me to start the education process on this issue is a question that someone actually asked me, and it's been the most powerful question that I think about often. And that question is, and this is for people in the white community who aren't really sure if this is a real issue or don't know, how to respond to this issue. The greatest question that somebody ever asked me is, how would your life be different if you were Black? Because I think until you can honestly answer that question and say nothing, I think that alone proves that there is an issue. So the education process starts with that question: how would my life be different if I was Black, right? I've processed that. I'm in the process of still educating myself. There's been some really great things that have helped me to move forward. And at this point, Stephen, to ask the question, the question that I'm left with, because I really want to make sure that my response is supportive and is loving. And my wife and I talk a lot about love language, right? So love language the way you give love doesn't really matter if it's not the other person's love language, right? And I want to make sure that the way that I'm showing love is really meaningful. So Mike, I'm gonna ask this question directly to you and for the other people who are watching. What is it that you want me to know when things like this happen? What is it that you're looking for? And how do you feel most supported and most loved during times like this?
Man, as we spoke yesterday, I think when you talked about love, that question is soaked in love. That's a love question, to genuinely want to help and know something at the same time from someone else. And so my answer to that is asking the question. Asking the question answers the question. Because just to be able to ask, that means you have a willingness to want to learn. And that's why I agree the education piece is always paramount first. Brother Malcolm X said, education is our passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for today. So once we start to get educated, and once asking that question, and then now receiving the knowledge, watching 13th, reading The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, reading The Color of Money by Mirza Badaran, reading these different historical books, because that's really what this comes down to in terms of education, because there's no way to truly understand what's going on now without wrestling with what went on in the past. Because all of those things show that, like what we talked about earlier, with police officers being a manifestation of slave patrols, where there were groups of people designated to capture runaway slaves and decide whether they could add judicial punishment or not. And then you talk about lynchings and the fact that it was interesting. An article came out the other day discussing how 75% of lynchings during the Jim Crow era, where there were more than 4,000 people that were lynched, 75% of those were done by law enforcement. And that, in fact, and most of them didn't go to trial. And in fact, when they as they looked at the study, a lot of the places where these police shootings are happening are also the same areas in which there were high numbers of lynchings. That history is so valuable because it helps for us to understand the current criminal justice system, that an unequal criminal justice system that we're in. So asking that question is beautiful, because that question now opens up the opportunity to educate and to give these different things. So those are the things, because there's so much to know, but taking it step by step and just being willing, because I believe once you have the willingness, now you've broken the walls of, because I think once you're willing to hear, then you're willing to act, because you're willing to change. And once that starts to happen, then the wheels become in motion. Because I've always, more so than ever in the past 4 to 5 years, I've come to this understanding that we will never, as the ADOS community, the Black community at large, we will never change the American racist system without the help of allies. We all have to do this together. 42 million Black people in America, 14% of the population. Nothing's going to change it. Nothing has ever changed by just Black people. Abolitionists during slavery were white and Black. The Civil Rights Movement, they had white ministers come down to Selma, and that was part of the hoopla when the officers were doing all the things and signify, because they had white ministers from, I think it was Maine, that came down. So we have to do this together. And so with asking questions like that, creates the conversation, creates the avenue for change, and creates the atmosphere for love to stay in the middle.
Yeah, man, our goal today has been for you to begin this journey of reconciliation. Like, we serve a God who talked about, the ministry of reconciliation, reconciling us. And the question that Joe mentioned is, as Mike talked about too, is pinnacle and is paramount to what our goal is as Christians. So I hope that this has been a blessing to you. I just want to leave you with the text that we shared yesterday. Mike, I don't know if you want to read it in Galatians 4.
Galatians 4:16. That's one of my favorite texts, and it is one of my favorite texts because I have a kind of like a direct kind of personality where I kind of say what I want, and then
I see you in this text, by the way.
You do, right? This is one of those texts where I just kind of it truly, and so Steve is a good friend of mine, so he knows this is a text that truly embodies who I am and part of what I feel like God has called me specifically to in my ministry. But I believe others can resonate with it too. And so Paul is speaking to the church at Galatia. And this is the New Living Translation version. It's Galatians 4:16, and it says, "Have I now become your enemy because I am telling you the truth? Have I now become your enemy because I'm telling you the truth?" And so it's a powerful text because it speaks to what Paul was dealing with at the time in the church of Galatia, having varying different issues, moving further away from God, getting into pagan rituals, and different things are infiltrating the church. And Paul is reminding them of the things that they were called to do. And then at this point, he sees people getting upset because Paul is admonishing them, basically telling them, hey guys, just like the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, reminding them, hey, remember what God has called you to do. Remember what you're supposed to do. And in the backlash, Paul reminds them, wait a minute, I'm just telling you the truth. And that doesn't make me your enemy. In fact, that makes me someone who loves you. And so we all have to be able to be okay with standing firm on truth, because what was interesting about the text is he said, am I therefore your enemy because I tell you the truth? Well, who is the truth? Jesus said he is the way, the truth, and the life. Paul was telling them, am I your enemy because I tell you about Jesus? Because I remind you of Jesus. We're saying the same thing when we're dealing with reconciliation, racial reconciliation, when we're dealing with the least of these, Matthew 25:40. are we your enemies because we tell you what Jesus' call was for us to preach the truth?
Man, I'm just thinking about truth and love and how those are connected. And there's so much.
Yes, sir.
Man, guys, I thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you all for tuning in. We will be posting a link with some resources and some ways for you to grow in this conversation and to have it with your family, with your friends. Because our goal as Christians and our goal at Lifeline is to our text, if you guys may not know this, is to walk before the Lord in the land of the living. And that's our goal, is to walk before the Lord and to accomplish the task that He's laid before us, and ultimately to be in His kingdom. And so feel free to leave comments, reach out to us. We may potentially surprise you with a part 2 if these guys are willing. But next week we're gonna be Mike is gonna be sharing a message next week as we kind of continue talking about this. God bless, take care, and we appreciate you. God bless, take care.
My shepherd, I have all I need. He lets me have rest in meadows of green. Even when I walk through darkness so deep, I will not be afraid. Fighting for me. I will live in the house of the Lord forever. Live in the house of the Lord forever. Live in the house of the Lord forever and ever. Amen. I will live in the house of the Lord forever. Live in the house of the Lord. Live in the house of the Lord forever and ever. Amen. I know you're beside me, remembering me. You're there when I'm hiding, setting me free. I will give it all away to keep you with me, to feel your warm embrace, my crucified King.